So tonight, we welcome Julie O'Donnell. Now that Julie is retired from a career in public education, she devotes her time to educational outreach regarding the importance of growing native plants and creating habitat gardens. Julie is a wildlife habitat steward with the National Wildlife Federation. She is a team leader of a community of wildlife habitat in Snohomish County, and she's a Washington Native Plant Society volunteer. In addition to growing over 200 species of native plants, Julie's focus has been on observing the usefulness of native plants for native bees, butterflies, and birds. So please join me in welcoming Julie O'Donnell.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And the screen looks all right?
Yes, it does.
Yep, it'll go. Okay. All right. So tonight we're going to look at some of the many native pollinators that we might see in Puget Sound gardens, parks, and natural areas, although many of these insects are found in other parts of the state as well. And the majority of the photos were taken in our garden by my daughter, Megan, including those shown here. And I will point out the characteristics that help identify these insects, and as well as features in the landscape that allow pollinators to coexist with human activity. So as I think this group is pretty savvy. So as you know, a pollinator can be any insect, bird, or animal that transfers pollen from one flower to another flower of the same species. And successful pollination results in the formation of fruit and seeds. Hummingbirds, butterflies, and moths, bees, beetles, flies, and wasps that visit flowers may all contribute to pollination. Bats that pollinate are found in Mexico, in the Southwest, and in the tropics, but not here in our state. I'll refer to native plants as those found locally before the arrival of Europeans. And they are, for the most part, they are best adapted to the local soils, the climate, too much rain, too little rain in the summer, and they are co-adapted, co-evolved, and codependent with our local pollinators. And so Pacific ninebark is, as you can see here, it's very attractive. It also attracts many other types of bees, wasps, butterflies. So I check it every day in May. It's a very large native shrub that needs full sun. And in our area, in Western Washington, we have Physocarpus capitatus. And Eastern Washington, you will see Physocarpus malvaceus. But there's also an East Coast species that is often sold here because it has an ornamental purple-leaved form. To find our locally adapted native shrubs, look for the species name Capitatus or malvaceus, which the common name is mallow ninebark in Eastern Washington. So here we have honeybees, Apis mellifera, and they are not native to North America. They're a domesticated insect that was brought here from Europe and elsewhere. So they are not the topic of this program. Instead, we'll look at pollinators that are native to our region. Insect pollination is needed for many food crops and 85% or more of the world's flowering plants. In the wake of colony collapse disorder that affected honeybees around 2006, interest in native pollinators has increased, and it's been found they do an excellent job pollinating crops when they have nearby natural areas where they can nest and overwinter. Estimates in the value of pollination by native bees in North America amounts to billions of dollars annually. So the program follows the story of our family garden, and it's really about habitat. That is the core of this program. And I'm not as much a bee expert as many of you in this group, but I can answer most of your questions about native plants, I hope. So habitat and native plants, I feel a little more confident than bee identification. So here we are looking at how the garden looks in autumn. And the inset photo shows that there were few plants and we had very few pollinators when we moved here 35 years ago. These books by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the National Wildlife Federation guided plant choices that brought the half-acre to life. The plantings become increasingly natural toward the back, where a small meadow with wildflowers leads into a natural area with native plants. And right here, I'm moving that cursor, there's this big round shrub in the middle back. That is the Pacific ninebark. It's really quite large. So this is a certified wildlife habitat, and I put the National Wildlife website in the box below because signing up with National Wildlife supports education, and it connects us with community wildlife habitat efforts and pollinator activities across North America. So it's a way to cast a vote that shows we care about our local wildlife and insect communities. So here's a closer look at the far back, and that's Pacific rhododendron with the pink flowers. In front of it is red huckleberry, and it's growing back here with mock orange and twinberry, osoberry, and vine maple to offer a succession of nectar and pollen. This is where thimbleberry and salmonberry grow with enough space to spread as they're kind of roaming plants. And it's also where the logs and brush piles are offering nest sites to both pollinators and birds. And the variety of native plants supports a diversity of insects. Before we move on to bees, it's worth mentioning that most of our butterflies require specific native plants for their larval stage. And from the top, we have red admiral, Satyr anglewing, and Milbert's tortoiseshell that all rely almost exclusively on stinging nettles. Nettles, I do grow them, and it's painful to grow nettles. They spread by rhizomatous. They come up in the lawn, they sting anybody who goes by. So they're not well suited to gardens at all, but it's really important to have them in our natural areas if we wish to see these butterflies. So after planting for butterflies, the garden filled with nectar-rich flowers, and we began to see many pollinators. And while the butterflies are waiting for the sun to shine, just like right now, we're starting to see bumblebees already, and flies, and all kinds of bees are starting to emerge. And in 2012, I had the opportunity to be part of a citizen science project by a UW graduate student, Hillary Burgess. And Hillary was looking into gardens that had native plants and comparing them to average gardens that maybe didn't, to find out how that would affect pollinators. And so I signed up for that along with Megan to receive training and learn about the insects that we had in our garden. So I'd like to share with you some of what we learned. And here again, you guys might already know this, but I'm going to do it as a quick review. And if we have anyone new in the group, this might help them. So bees and wasps share several characteristics. They both have long antennae, eyes along the sides of the head, and 4 wings. They differ in that the bees provision their nest, their brood cells, with pollen as a protein source for their larvae. And so they have branched hairs called scopae for plural, scopa for singular, that really help them gather, collect, and hold and transfer the pollen all the way back to the nest. And so here on the left is this little beauty. I'm almost afraid to say what I think this is because I know we've got Will out there. So if he wants to put it in the chat box, that'd be great. Or some other expert, that'd be fine. But I'm just looking at very hairy legs, lots of scopae, and of course the thorax and the head. And so we know that's a bee. We think it's mining bees, but I don't know. I hope that's right. And a mining bee. Anyway, we have quite a few around, so we enjoy watching them. I think they're beautiful. Beautiful eyes.
We have a couple of people that have chimed in on the identification, Andrina, and Will says Andrina pronorum.
Oh, good. Okay.
Go for in my language, a mining bee. And one other quick comment, because you were just chatting about it, can stinging nettle be planted in a container to prevent it from spreading? Colleen had asked.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I tried growing it alongside the shed where it had a wall behind it, and I used garden fence around 3 sides, and it was always popping through. And those runners, they kept bumping up against the beams that I used in the ground to contain it. It wasn't happy. It just was bent on escaping above ground and below ground. So, you know, you guys try things, but I don't think it'll be very successful. Find a natural area somewhere and tuck in a patch where it won't attack children or, you know, innocent dog walkers, and just maybe have it somewhere in a green belt. I think that's really the way to go. And thank you for that. We thought this was Andrina also. And so, you know, again, normally I'm just a little less confident with my ID with this crowd. But anyway, yes, a beautiful little bee. So, okay, we all know that's a wasp, one of my favorites. It's a potter wasp, and I'll talk about this a few slides later. It will have its own. But how do we recognize a wasp? Well, smooth shine. It doesn't have the branch tears. It doesn't have the scopae, and a narrow waist and a pointed abdomen. And of course, it's got long antennae, and then the eyes are at the side of the head. Hard to see on this very black little wasp, but they provision their nest, their larvae, with other insects for a protein source. So they don't need to have the scopae for collecting pollen. Okay, at the bottom, if you haven't already tested yourself on this, well, it does have some hairs, but look at the position of the eyes across the top. And there are very small antennae coming out. So that's a characteristic of a fly. And flies only have 2 wings, although we can't see those on the living insect very well. Okay, that was our little review refresher. And we'll start with bumblebees because I just think they're so amazing. They're probably the best adapted to northern climates of the pollinators. And there are as many as 25 species in Washington state. They form colonies with 1 queen and many workers, so they're a social bee. They are difficult to ID because different species have similar color patterns. So Bumblebees of North America and xerces.org go into this in detail, but also washingtonbumblebees.org is very helpful. I wish I had had that 10 years ago because it narrows down, these are the bees that are here. So thank you for that, David. Really great website. And now that was funny that we had this conversation during your bee share. So, you know, I'm thinking it's Bombus Voss because it's so big. A friend took this photo, however. And I especially like to say that this is the most common bumblebee here in Western Washington. And so that's another reason it's probably Bombus Voss nasenskyii. And that yellow bump, as you already know, is a corbiculum or pollen basket. And that indicates this is a female because only the female worker bees and the queen bee will collect the pollen and return to the nest to tend the brood cells. To understand the life cycle of a bumblebee, we'll start about 1 o'clock up there where it's late winter, early spring. And that's about the time, like right now, the queens are late this year. Sometimes I have them a whole month earlier, but they are coming out now. And when the queens emerge from overwintering and they find enough nectar and pollen, they will look for a nest site. And once the queen settles into a nest site, she'll lay eggs to produce the first worker bees. When the workers emerge, the queen down about 6 o'clock on this circle, the queen will stay in the nest to lay eggs and the workers will go out and do all the foraging. By mid to late summer, the workers die and new queens and males emerge. They mate, and by the end of the summer, everybody except for the newly mated queens die. The new queens, they will continue foraging right up until frost, and they overwinter under leaves, in old rodent burrows, in stacks of wood, old sheds, and I'll go into that a little more later as well. So a queen bumblebee lives approximately 1 year. This is a garden photo, and it shows the size of a large queen next to a smaller male. And this is autumn helenium. And this is a wonderful native wildflower that flowers late in summer, end of August into September, sometimes even into October. And pollinators love it. The bumblebees love it. And when you go to purchase it, most plant retailers are selling hybrids. And the hybrid varieties typically have less pollen, less nectar. And so to support pollinators, the native species as close as possible are preferred. And usually you'd have to find this plant at a native plant sale or from a specialty grower. And, I think it's harder to find than it used to be, but at washingtonbumblebees.org, we had a plant list for pollinators, and I'm not sure it's still there or not. But also the Washington Native Plant Society, also, again, kind of embedded in this huge website. But if you go to plants and then look for gardening and landscaping, you will find a plant list called Waterwise Gardening for Pollinators, or Waterwise Plants for Pollinators. And it's just an excellent list of native plants that they're divided a little by where they grow. So some are coastal, some are woodland. So very helpful resource. Okay, so bumblebees have actually, I should say berries, both native and non-native berries have a symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationship with bumblebees. And at the bottom is evergreen huckleberry, beautiful little native shrub, widely used in landscaping. Its flowers attract bumblebees. It'll be the next thing they'll be using, I think, pretty soon, and hummingbirds. And as a result of pollination, there are berries for people and birds and wildlife. And raspberries and blueberries also rely on pollination by bumblebees. So after taking photos all summer, Megan was very good at identifying the bees. She actually spent more time on bee identification than I did because she wasn't making dinner and running off to work and things like that. So she's the in-house, what do you think this is? But anyway, we knew some bees were in decline, and she sent this photo to the Xerces Society, and they sent it to Stanford, and it came back, yes, this is Bombus occidentalis, the Western bumblebee that was in 2012 and still now had become rare and was in serious decline. And there were still some remnant populations back then. So we were really excited to find this bee. And you can see what a magnet, this is actually the Midwestern milkweed, and this Specios is native. So it's Asclepias syriaca, and it's fragrant and it's rhizomatous. So I have this really rangy, messy, I must have 20 or 30 or 40 stems coming up randomly in the garden. But look what it does. It attracts the pollinators. So here's a honeybee for comparison. And up in the upper left corner, around 11 o'clock, are some tiny little bees. And I sure hope we still see these this summer. So that was the beginning of finding the Western bumblebee. This photo was taken by conservation biologist Rich Hatfield in Oregon. And this, at one time, was the most common bumblebee in the Western United States. And to understand what happened to them, it helps to know that bumblebees can vibrate their wing muscles up to 200 approximately times per second. That number varies. And that allows them to warm themselves, fly in cool weather, and to perform buzz pollination to the flowers of New World crops. So they are especially effective at pollinating squash family plants like cucumbers, pumpkins, tomato family, peppers, blueberries, all the berries. and they were in demand for greenhouse grown crops. And there's two slightly different versions of how this takes place, but the one I learned was that Western bumblebee queens were sent to Europe, and they were sent to breeding facilities. And when they were shipped back to the United States, it's believed they carried with them a European pathogen that's thought to be the cause of their decline. And there's a lot of concern around that because the closely related Franklin's bumblebee of Oregon and California is now thought to be extinct. And I'd like to invite you, if you have a pencil and paper, to jot down The Old Man and the Bee on CNN. It's at the bottom of the screen, right under the bumblebee. You have to just do a search. This is a video of a bumblebee researcher out in the field looking for bumblebees, and it's only about 6 minutes. I've watched it a number of times, and it's just fascinating, very insightful, and explains what the bumblebees are up against a little bit. So I hope you'll take the time to look for that. So fairy bells is a delicate wildflower for the woodland edge. In a few minutes, we will see more flowers and plants, but first let's look at some of the lesser known pollinators. So bees that build an individual nest without a queen or worker, as you know, are called solitary bees. But I often talk to garden clubs and groups like that, and they are not familiar with social bees versus solitary bees. So it's a good thing to identify for people. And so, as you know, mason bees, sweat bees, mining and leafcutter bees are common examples. If you look at the lower right here, there is a tiny little sweat bee, I believe. Anyway, a tiny little bee with lots of scopae on its legs, covered with lots of yellow pollen from yarrow. So it shows how small they can be. So the blue orchard mason bee, discussed earlier, Osmia lignaria, is active from March to June at the right time to pollinate fruit trees. And this little female is solitary, and she spends all her time foraging and nest building. And so solitary bees don't have workers to defend the nest, so they're very unlikely to sting, and they're considered gentle, even if they were handled and managed to sting, but that's not what they're all about. And so mason bees only forage or only pollinate within 300 feet of their nest. They need a source of mud to seal their brood chambers. And they are especially effective. It takes about 250 mason bees to pollinate 1 acre of apple trees, where 15,000 or more honeybees are needed to accomplish the same pollination. Some reasons for their effectiveness include their ability to dislodge and transfer more pollen, and their tolerance for flying in cold and damp weather. So somewhere between 70 and 90% of native bees, mostly the solitary bees, nest underground. Even if you don't intend to plant something, removing lawn can improve the chance that bees will have access to nest sites. And so here are the nests of our little mining bee. They've grouped them together where they found a suitable sandy, well-drained soil that doesn't get routinely watered. That's their preference. And protection from foot traffic and soil disturbance and pets is also helpful. And here is, we don't have as good a camera as some of you, but anyway, here's a cute little bee face popping out of its nest. And the metallic green sweat bee was also taken locally. So these bees definitely are around and trying to live close into habitation. And anyway, just enjoy seeing them. And so Douglas Talmy tells us that in the United States, we've converted an area 8 times the size of New Jersey to lawn. He further says if we convert half that area back to native plants, over 20 million acres will become available to pollinators, birds, and wildlife. And if you haven't read his newest book, Nature's Best Hope, it's really just classic tell me. It's very inspiring about here's what we can do. We can build habitat. And the new book has a chapter on pollinators. So here we have nests, again, solitary bees that are grouped together. And this is a rock garden in North Seattle. And here the bees have found sandy, well-drained soil, doesn't get routinely watered. And so it just, they're really around. We just need to keep looking for them and hopefully give them more habitat. Okay, so that's a favorite little photo. And we do have the veins on the wings and iridescence showing up in this photo. Okay, so bee, wasp, fly. So we look at the head. We know the large eyes across the top and the small antennae mean it's a fly. So it's usually called a hover or syrphid fly and belongs to a large family of flower flies. Very cool little flies. Okay, let's look on the right first. So we have this very furry looking insect. Tempting to think it's a bumblebee, but if you look on the left, there's the head, these huge eyes that go across the top of the head, tiny antennae help us identify it as a Narcissus bulb fly. And it is a bumblebee mimic. So don't be fooled by that hairy look. It's not truly scopy. So wasps also transfer pollen as they visit flowers. This is called a bee wolf because it hunts bees to feed its larvae. And here the adult is simply foraging for itself on goldenrod. The potter wasp builds a solitary mud nest. It looks like it attached them to some leaves in that photo. And it is beneficial. It eats the larvae of spruce budworm and alfalfa weevil. And since wasps are predators of other insects, they often help with insect control. Now, as with solitary bees, the potter wasp spends all her time foraging and nest building, and she doesn't have workers to defend the nest, so they're unlikely to sting. They're not on the attack. I really enjoy seeing them in the garden. They just have these curious yellow lines, and they're very docile, and they're just all about their business, foraging on the flowers.
Question that came up about what you're speaking about. Tony wants to know if the male wasps he says male wasps collect pollen after certain points in the summer. What happens to the pollen? I'm not sure I'm reading that right, Tony.
Yeah, I don't think male wasps do collect pollen. That's not their job. Their job is to mate. That's what they do. Then they're done.
Yeah, I've seen lots of wasps, particularly bee wolves, covered with lots of pollen. And I do understand that something happens with it, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, well, it does get dragged around the flower, so they are helping pollinate. But what they do with it back at the nest, that's an entomologist question.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And even flower beetles will play a role in pollination. And the fossil record suggests they were part of some of the earliest pollinators in Jurassic period flowering plants, about 150 million years ago. Bees appeared closer to 100 to 130 million years ago, for comparison. And Pearly Everlasting is another great flower for pollinators. So in the last 10 or more years, the European wool carder bee has appeared in the Puget Sound region. And this bee has yellow and black markings, and it's fairly territorial. It can be a bit intimidating if you come too close to where it's claiming territory. And from the last I heard, we don't know how this bee is affecting our native pollinators. I don't know if it's just keeping to itself or if it's causing a problem for them. I haven't heard. Okay, so we'll move on to garden practices and some more plants in a few minutes. And so, as you know, we greatly need to reduce our use of chemicals. And in the United States, it's said that over 100 million acres of corn, wheat, soy, and cotton are treated with neonicotinoids annually. And neonicotinoids are systemic, and so they move through all parts of the plant, even the roots, so it makes them really toxic. This is a linden tree. It's ornamental, and meaning it's not native. It's planted to line streets and parking lots and things like that. But its flowers are very attractive to bumblebees, but they're also very high up and they're small. And so they're hard to see. And it's even hard to notice that the bumblebees are up there unless you're looking for them. Linden trees also attract aphids that secrete a sticky substance, and that increases the chance the trees will be sprayed to kill the aphids. In June 2013, 50 flowering linden trees were sprayed at a shopping center in Wilsonville, Oregon. Over 100,000 bumblebees were killed. They covered the parking lot. The Xerces Society was called in to estimate how many bees and what happened. And so in addition to agriculture, the use of pesticides on ornamentals is furthering pollinator decline. So it's increasingly common for seed to be pre-treated with these neonics, and that's a huge problem because they're systemic and the seed sprouts, and then even the flowers are toxic, the nectar, the pollen. And so I look for organic seed just for the sake of the pollinators, and it's also a possibility that plants are pre-treated. So when I go to a plant store to buy something, I let the salespeople know, hey, I need plants that are pesticide-free, that are safe for bees and butterflies. And I think in response to, I'm so glad there's a concern about that, we're coming up now with bee-safe labels like the one in this picture. And so I think it helps build awareness to have those conversations, and it's good to let retailers know that that's a deal breaker, whether or not we'll buy their plants. On the left, we have the autumn helenium again, and it's best to look for these single-flowered, old-fashioned varieties instead of the hybrids or the new cultivars or the double-flowered varieties that may have reduced nectar or pollen. So to build a sunny or create a sunny meadow for your pollinators, just choose a spot in full sun or as much sun as you have, and plant goldenrod, native asters, lupin, and fireweed you may or may not want to plant. I brought a branch home from a hike one day that was covered with seeds and just waved it all over my garden. And now I have fireweed, and it's beautiful. It's tall. I let it grow in with my shrubs because it would overwhelm a flower bed. But for the other flowers, they all spread. They all are very competitive. And if we try to grow them with regular garden flowers, they take over. So give them their own space, let them go wild, and the bees will notice. And the fireweed is pretty delightful. Look at that little leafcutter bee coming in. And it also attracts hummingbirds and butterflies. And now these are fireweed leaves, and you can see they are well used by our leafcutter bees. And so the long cuts are used to line the sides of the bee's little larval cell, brood cell, and the round pieces cap the ends. And I try to just be happy. I see that. Actually, I look for it. If I don't see it, I get concerned. Well, the leafcutter bees haven't been here yet, but they have to find a nest site too. So they will go into some of our logs. I have red elderberry. It gets kind of pithy. It's a soft wood. And I've seen them move into little logs of red elderberry, and also here in the sand in our garden. Here's another little leaf cutter bee, and it's got this shorter abdomen. And I wouldn't be surprised if someone wants to weigh in if they know they're leaf cutter bees, or if I'm wrong about that, please say so. But look at the veins on the wings. So that's just pretty wonderful. And I know that helps with ID. But I like to tell people it's not necessary to purchase leafcutter bees for summer pollination, because the leafcutter bees that are being sold are the alfalfa Megachile rotundata, right? Something, if I said it right, but the alfalfa leafcutter bee. And unless you're trying to grow alfalfa seed, you probably don't need those bees, because we have so many of our own leafcutters and our bumblebees, our little small solitary bees. And bringing in bees that aren't really needed can create competition for the bees that are already here. And it could potentially add pathogens or parasites that aren't here. So better to just support the bees we have with habitat. So allowing fallen leaves to remain on the ground gives queen bumblebees a place to overwinter. And this queen was emerging from this area. Those are the leaves of snowdrops. So it was quite early when she came out from these leafy layers. And the leaves they're just wonderful. They act as a mulch, but they also give the bumblebees a place to burrow down under for the winter. And it's best to avoid weed barriers, avoid beauty bark, avoid wood chips, because the bees cannot access the soil through those materials. So about 30% of the native bees nest above ground, and then their nests can be found, and let's start on the upper left, in logs, in twigs with hollow centers, in stacks of wood at the bottom, in clumps of undisturbed grass, and in spaces in rock walls. Also old sheds. We had an old shed, and it had bumblebees that would nest in a stack of 2x4s in there. So even small snags, logs, and stumps can serve as nest sites. So find a place to leave logs and branches on the ground for this purpose. And then both red and blue elderberry have these pithy stems that become hollow. So they are a nice place for some of our small solitary bees will nest in those pithy stems. So when you're cleaning up, if you're cleaning up the garden, even berry stems or anything that has hollow centers, don't discard them. Just gently place them somewhere else nearby in case they already have larvae inside. So where snags are in short supply, bumblebees may move into a vacant birdhouse. And they do like to use a nest box that's been previously occupied, because they'll build upon the material already inside. And if this happens, try to appreciate that you have nesting bees and put up another house for the birds. It's probably the most humane thing to do and to help our pollinators. To offer water, in the lower left, a saucer with sloping wood or rocks gives pollinators access, and other insects. And insects will also use a wet leaf like a raft, and they'll just ride it out in the middle of, I have a little bog garden pond, and they'll sit out there and sip the water on the water lily leaves. But mud might be even more important, because the potter wasp, the beneficial potter wasp, needs it for its nest, and the mason bees need mud. And you can even get butterflies that may come down to puddle on some mud. So this is soil that's just been dug up from the ground. It's not potting soil, and it's sitting in the bog garden. Looks awful to us. It's winter in this picture, but the bees use it. The mason bees use it and nest nearby. So if we were in person, I would ask people, raise their hands, how many people have the bees in your backyard? I'm guessing many of you already have this book. And so it's a wonderful introduction to the many bees that may be right around town, right around where we live. On the left, we have Butterfly Gardening by the North American Butterfly Association, and it features gardens that incorporate native plants. Below that is Victory Gardens for Bees. It comes down from Canada. So it's fun to see the bees. Here we have somebody from Vancouver Island, and she may already know about this book. But this is a really nice book that dovetails well with this program. And on the right are books by the Xerces Society, and they're available from xerces.org and other places now. These books are becoming more and more available. Attracting Native Pollinators is just probably my favorite book for habitat, plants, bees, butterflies, native plants. It covers a lot of information. Okay, so one of the goals of planting for pollinators is to offer a succession of nectar and pollen. And native shrubs do this especially well. I'm going to start on the upper left with our native willows that flower in, well, right now, February and March. In the middle, osoberry flowers in March and announces the end of winter, and that's flowering right now where I live. And then on the upper right is tall Oregon grape. And so a key benefit of our native plants is that they have this overlapping succession of flowering times. And you know, it's fascinating to watch how that happens. There's the main plant that everybody's after, and when those flowers start to wrap up, something else comes right on schedule to be there for the pollinators. So it's impressive. Okay, lower left is twinberry, and twinberry flowers in April, May, and June, even into July. And it will have bumblebees and hummingbirds on it pretty much the whole time. By May, there's an abundance of floral resources, including thimbleberry in the middle and our shrubs in the genus Ceanothus. So this overlapping succession of flowering times is a real benefit of our native shrubs. And the flowers come into play with that too. But the shrubs make it easy, because they're this huge floral bouquet over a pretty long season. Okay, it's your turn to think about, I know you're going to recognize this, so I'm going to give you a minute to think about what this flower is. Okay, so it's not flowering yet, but these are the flowers of big leaf maple, Acer macrophyllum. And mason bees and some bumblebees time their emergence to when these flowers are in bloom. And our Northwest biologists consider our native willows and the native maples to be some of the most important trees for our pollinators. And also cascara. I have to mention cascara because cascara, the bumblebees are all over that. And I don't think I included a picture in this program, but it's a nice mid-sized tree, so it'll fit in a lot of gardens. It's somewhat shade tolerant, but it also grows in full sun. And then snowberry grows throughout the state, and it has a long flowering season. Most of the summer, it continues to flower even as these berries are forming in August and September. And it's drought tolerant. It spreads slowly to form a thicket. It will flower best in full sun, but it will tolerate bright shade. So excellent for our bumblebees. Our native penstemons and angelicas are beautiful, grow well in gardens, provided the gardens has soil with good drainage. And then our Western columbine is kind of a crowd pleaser. People often plant it to attract hummingbirds, but you can see it also benefits other creatures beyond just the hummingbirds. So we have a bumblebee robbing nectar because it doesn't fit inside that narrow flower. And in this case, the butterfly is doing a better job of pollination. Another flower that meets the needs of more than one species is goat's beard, really common in the mountains, beautiful wildflower. And on the left, we have a leafcutter bee. Up at the top center is a potter wasp, and on the right is a flower beetle. And in May, it also attracts, I get cedar hair streaks on the goat's beard in my garden as well, and sometimes echo azures. So butterflies come to it as well. So native plants are beautiful. They are the foundation of habitat, and our pollinators depend on them. In the time that's left, I will show the steps in converting sod or lawn into habitat. So in 2013, I was asked to create a pollinator garden at a school. We're looking at a south wall where four raised beds were built for a garden club. And the techniques that follow can be applied to other settings. They'll work in many different situations. So this photo was taken in the winter of 2013. From this angle, we can see that grounds workers have sprayed weed killer around the raised beds. In the background, there's a green belt with native plants, and that's where the trees, shrubs, snags, logs, brush piles, fallen leaves, lots of good habitat in there. And I have inadvertently, I was planting something in those woods and actually dug up a queen bumblebee in February. And she was so groggy. I think it might have been Sichensis, or I don't know, it was one of the little ones. It was just a real olivey gray, nondescript kind of bumblebee. And I gently put her back under the leaves and tried not to disturb her and planted the red elderberry somewhere else. But anyway, good habitat right close by, and we will use that fire hydrant as a point of reference. So even though I was working with the garden club, permission was needed from the principal to make changes, followed by approval from the school district, and they needed a plan. So along with this plan, I submitted a plant list, a larger site map, and an installation plan with 3 stages. And it shows, here's our fire hydrant on the far left, no plants within 6 feet. It's only about 14 feet across, and it's about 36 feet to the first raised bed. So the school district didn't want these large shrubs. And as happened, the second plan showed changes and allowed the project to move forward. And so this garden does include natives and non-natives because, you know, when the kids are at school and the teachers and parents are coming back, they wanted a show of color. And so that's factored in here. So it's just a mix of natives and ornamentals. So by May of 2013, we began sheet mulching the sod with large overlapping sheets of cardboard, and 6 to 8 inches of beauty bark went on top of that, only because we had it on site at no extra cost. By the end of June, sheet mulching was complete, and the garden just sat there for the summer so the cardboard could break down and kill the sod below. And it looked a lot better too. So as it was, I would have preferred to use compost in the planting areas, but the beauty bark did hold down and hide the cardboard. So it was functional in that way. By autumn, we received one of those free chip drops where they drop off wood chips for free, and we spread them in the areas that would become the paths. And this photo was taken in January of 2014 and marked the beginning of phase 2. Site preparation was done and we began planting. And here are the first plantings of asters, goldenrod, and Oregon grape. By May, the students came back. I took out the photo with the students because of, you know, everybody's getting touchy about things these days. But anyway, there were students in some of the photos, and they planted. native birchleaf spirea, evergreen huckleberry, and ornamental lavender. And looking west toward that fire hydrant and the green belt, this is where I planted goldenrod, native asters, and some large clumping grass was added here to be potential nest sites for bumblebees and a host plant for woodland skipper butterflies. And also, this is a little more lightly maintained area over by the fire hydrant. And so clover came up here. And we just let it be there because the bumblebees were on it all summer, both kinds, the white and the red. Okay, a year later, July 2015, the flowers are filling in, and we went out in the green belt and gathered logs to outline the garden beds. And it was surprisingly helpful in keeping both students and dog walkers on the paths. And simple. Also that summer, the garden club planted seeds and flowers for pollinators, which was a lot of fun. And with the planting complete, that marked the end of phase 2 and the beginning of phase 3, general maintenance that includes edging, weeding, and replenishing wood chips. By the spring of, this is May 2016, the fire hydrant is no longer visible. In the foreground, we have chives in one of the beds, raised beds. There are coral bells in the middle, and beyond that is our large leaf lupin. And they began flowering in May and continued flowering into June. And July, we have the white flowers are birchleaf spirea, purple lavender behind that, coral bells, and in the background is elegant clarkia. Now, elegant clarkia is an annual wildflower native to California, and it was planted from seed by the garden clubs. And besides being beautiful, it had bumblebees on it all summer. And that south wall is hot, and those bees were fast, and I never could get a photo of a bee. They just were zipping, and I think they didn't like me being there, or they didn't like the sound of the camera humming or something, so they just seemed to take off whenever I tried to get their photo. But they were very prolific on this wildflower. So goldenrod attracts many insects, and here it's fun to look at this creature. And is it a Halictus rubicundus? That's my question to you. You can say yes, no, or tell me what it is there in the chat. Okay, so we know it's a bee. We have long antennae, and look at the scope on the legs. So we know it's a bee, and it's not alone. The crab spider had taken on the hue of the goldenrod, and it was poised, ready to capture prey, but I think it wanted something smaller because it didn't move at this point. So the bees and the birds came to the pollinator garden right away, but it took butterflies a bit longer. And by August, we had woodland skippers on the lavender and the pearly everlasting. And looking west in September, the goldenrod was finished blooming. It blooms early here, July, and into August, and then it's done. And instead of goldenrod, we have these purple New England asters and the yellow autumn helenium, fuchsia magellanica, and the tall plant is Joe pieweed. And so we still had pollinators coming, including this beautiful West Coast lady, Vanessa Annabella. And she spent most of a week. I come home from work, and the first thing I do, I drive to the school so I could see if she was still there every day. And for a number of days, she just fed on these flowers. And so the West Coast lady, one of the host plants for it are stinging nettles. And so it just always, okay, there's nettles in this neighborhood because we're able to have some of these butterflies. So goldenrod really demonstrates the saying, plant and they will come. If you want to find out what pollinators you have in your neighborhood or your garden, try planting goldenrod because I just think it's amazing. it's just so alive with activity. So, okay, here we have our big Bumble. Maybe it's a Bombus vos, probably. And then we have a honeybee. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 more pollinators on here. That one might be a wasp. But anyway, so it's pretty delightful to see all the creatures that come to goldenrod. So these photos were taken while standing near the fire hydrant. And on the left, from the first plantings in winter of 2014, to the right, where we have 2.5 years later, a garden filled with nectar and pollen. It's just been really rewarding to see these changes. So I want to encourage you in your activities to plant for pollinators, because they show up, and I think it's the least we can do for them. So thank you for having me speak tonight. That's the end of the program, and I can take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much.